All right, hanging out here with Jason Foster, CBC Beer Columnist, BJCP Beer Judge, and just, I guess, one of the most knowledgeable beer guys in all of Alberta. How you doing, man?
I'm well.
That's good. So I think you love beer on almost every level that one could love beer. Obviously, as a consumer, but like super avid home brewer, as a journalist, and then as a judge as well. So what first brought you into the industry, or not even just as a consumer? What drew you to beer to begin with?
Well, I think I was always just like as a young man, I liked drinking beer. I didn't know much about it at the beginning.
Right.
And then I started homebrewing when I was in university. And basically I started to homebrew in order to, I realized I had to do one of two things. Either I had to drink less beer or find a way to get cheaper beer. And so I started brewing literally just like, it was literally the tin cans. You add like cups of corn sugar, stir it up, patch in dry yeast, and let it go in a plastic bucket. Like that's how I started homebrewing. Like this is back in the early 90s.
Right.
It was awful, but something clicked. Within a handful of batches, I elevated myself up to all grain in no time. I started self-teaching myself, about how to make beer and beer styles. I just started doing that. So something really got triggered in me about how there's something magical about turning these basic ingredients of malt and hops and yeast, and it comes out as, I think one of the things I love about beer is I feel like it's the most versatile alcoholic beverage on the planet.
Right.
Like you can make everything from the lightest blonde ale to the darkest, richest Russian Imperial Stout with only a fairly small tweaking of ingredients.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think I just really fell in love with that. So I fell in love with the process, and I fell in love with beer styles. And then from there, kind of getting engaged in the industry and becoming a beer writer and a beer educator just kind of flew kind of naturally. It just kind of happened. In part because the industry was a lot smaller than it is now.
Yeah.
Like when I started doing my blog on beer.org, and it's a website for those who don't know it, who looks on beer on the prairie, so Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. When I first started doing it about 10, 15 years ago, I literally could make 3 phone calls, right? And know exactly what was going on in all 3 provinces, all the new beer, all the new developments. It was amazing how. So I think a lot of what happened is it was a really small, really close knit industry, and I just kind of found myself in the middle of it.
So as a home brewer, was there a certain beer that I guess that maybe you had a beer somewhere and it just kind of like, changed your world? Because a lot of people have that where, you grow up with your very typical kind of light beers and beer is this, and then all of a sudden you go somewhere and you have a beer that just makes you think about, the community or the industry totally different. Did you have that epiphany?
I think I did. And I think what it was a couple of years after I started homebrewing, I did the stereotypical 3-month backpacking around Europe. I was in between jobs. And so I thought, I'll go and do this backpacking thing as a young 20-something. And yeah, like I remember, I think there was 2 moments, right? One was being in Belgium,
Yeah.
to Brussels. And it was like, what is this? And, I think it was an Orval, right? That was the beer. And I went, oh man, now I know that there's a whole other world of beer out there, right? That beer probably was one of the single biggest. And then the other one was being in Prague. And that wasn't even so much about the beer, although I became from that moment on a huge fan of Czech Dark Lager because there's just something really special about it.
Right.
But for me, it was more just that atmosphere where you've got the paper on the table, the server comes by with a big half-liter mug, doesn't even ask you if you want it or not, plunks it down, does a little ticky mark on the paper, and wanders off.
Yeah.
Right? Like a mind-blowing experience. And so I think those are the 2 that I kind of stick in my brain is affecting kind of how I brewed, and then also how I started to appreciate the experience around the beer itself, right? And so I've always, as a home brewer, tried to not just, here's my beer. I try to always kind of present it in the way it might be meant to be presented, and try and serve it at the temperature that it should be. So I try to replicate as much as you can in your own home the actual experience of beer. I don't do little ticky marks on the table, but my wife won't let me.
She does them. She knows how many you've had. You don't have to worry about that. That's why I say to my wife, I'm like, what I love about being married is I don't have to keep track of how many beers I've had. She'll do that.
Well, one thing I really like about being a beer writer and beer educator is that if I open up a beer and I have a beer in the evening, and my wife says, "You're having a beer?" I can go, "No, I'm working."
I'm working. I'm a workaholic. Yeah. So how did you progress then from a home brewer and just a lover of beer to, working with CBC and stuff like that? Like there's, I feel like there's quite a leap from just being an enthusiast to, then becoming kind of someone who people look to learn about it.
Yeah, I think I do feel like it kind of happened organically, but I do know that there was kind of a moment where it happened, and I was in a pub with some friends, and one of my friends happened at the time to be one of the editors of the Alt Weekly in Edmonton at the time. It was called View Weekly, doesn't exist anymore, and I was being my usual sort of high maintenance self in terms of ordering a beer, asking what's the list, what have you got from here, and blah blah blah, and he just looked at me and went, "God. You're so obnoxious." He says, "But we've just started doing a wine column. How do you want to do a beer column for us?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, that sounds fun."
Yeah.
So I did that for a couple of years and then realized I enjoyed it a lot. And so I actually cold called the producer of the CBC Afternoon Drive show. And that's because the morning show had a wine columnist.
Right.
And it kind of irritated me, even though I've come to know him and he's fine. He's a good guy. But at the time I'm like, "Oh, they could have a wine column. They should have a beer column." And so I cold called the producer and she's like, "Okay, well, let's give you a try. We'll bring you in for one. We'll see what you're like and we'll see where it goes." That was like 2008.
Wow.
And I've been doing it ever since.
So you're also a judge. So let's talk about what that is in terms of, so the BJCP, what is that?
It's the Beer Judge certification program. And so
Okay.
it's a non-profit organization based in the States that originally kind of formed itself a quarter century ago to support the homebrewing community, to create a community of trained and certified judges to be able to run beer competitions and to be able to basically improve the overall level of homebrew.
Right.
But over the years, as the craft beer industry's grown, it's become a bit of a standard of beer judging in the world. And so there's the Cicerone program, of course, as well, out of the States. But this is kind of, if you go and talk to a brewer, a professional brewer, they'll know the BJCP, they'll know its style guidelines, and they'll know that the judges there kind of know their stuff. And so what it is basically to get certified, you write this exam. It's a killer exam. They've changed it over the years. When I wrote it, it was 3 hours, 10 essay questions, and 3 beer evaluations in 3 hours.
Yeah.
They've broken it up now and stuff. It's still different now, and then based on your score and your experience, you can kind of elevate yourself up the ranks.
So now, as a judge, so we're at the Alberta Small Brewers Association convention today. What role did you play in the awards that they do?
Well, to be honest, I'm one of the co-founders of the Alberta Beer Awards with another Edmonton master level beer judge, Owen Kirkcaldy. He's a lawyer by trade. And basically what happened is a few years ago, he and I were just having a beer. And as two sort of experienced longtime beer judges who've organized competitions, in fact, we were actually judging a different competition. And we said, the industry is probably big enough now that it could do a competition and have it mean something.
Right.
And so we approached ASBA, who was a fairly new organization at the time, and said, "Look, if you want to partner with us, we'll run the competition. So we can be like the black box where beer comes in, we'll run the beer competition, get the judges, make sure it's all blind, make sure it's all done appropriately, and then we'll spit out winners at the other end." And so that's been happening. We're in the 5th iteration of it now. And yeah, we're quite pleased, and that's kind of where it comes from. It's a joint project of ASBA and Owen and myself.
So I was asking you this before we started to record, but when you're judging, what's the difference between, when you're judging a commercial product? So all the products that you're judging for this convention are commercial products. What's the difference in terms of the process when you're judging commercial versus homebrew?
Yeah, I think there are some subtle differences. I think I think the first thing to say for listeners, in case they're not clear about it, is the thing that's the same regardless, is that the judging is blind. The judges don't know whose beer they're sampling.
Right.
All they're told is this is the style of beer. Or if there's some special ingredient that's important for them to know is in there, that's all they know. That's all we get to know. So we don't know who we're doing or what we're doing. All we know, this is German Pilsners. That's all we know. And so that part's the same. And so I think the difference in a homebrew competition, the goal is to help the home brewer become a better brewer. And so that you do two things, I think, then. One is you get a little more rigorous about the styles and the style guidelines. So if they say that this beer is an American Pale Ale, you're going to say, okay, how close does this beer get to what we understand as to being some of the best American Pale Ales? So, in my head, I might think, okay, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is, one of the icons of that style. How close does this beer get to that beer?
Right.
And you kind of score it and evaluate it accordingly. Obviously, in both commercial and home brewing competitions, you're looking for flaws, you're looking for other things that might be a problem. I think in commercial brewing, though, in a brew competition, you don't get quite so hung up on the styles because their job is to sell beer, not to match some historical ideal.
Right.
And so you get a little looser around that element of it, and you bring in more an element of, does this beer hold together really well? Is it well balanced? Is it something that someone's going to want a pint of?
Yeah.
So I think that's the first key difference. And then the second key difference is with home brewers, you want to help them be better brewers, as I mentioned. And so that means you're going to be a little more active in telling them how they can make their beer better, how they can change their recipe, how they can change their brewing techniques to maybe, to produce a better product. You're not going to do that in a commercial competition because you're dealing with professional brewers. So A, it would be presumptive of me to tell a professional brewer, oh, you're mashing too warm. Like that's presumptive. And B, they're professionals. And so if I'm telling them that I'm picking up an infection or I'm picking up diacetyl, it's their job. Figure out how you get in diacetyl. What do you do about it? That's their job, not mine. And so you're not going to be quite as active in trying to help them fix the beer.
So you've been, obviously enjoying beer for a long time. But specifically, I'm curious about Alberta beer because you've seen kind of the rise of the craft beer industry. I'm just kind of curious what your take is on the state of the industry. So, in terms of quality, has there been a steady, improvement in quality? Where would you rank Alberta in general?
I guess there's a couple answers to that. I mean, no, there has not been a steady improvement in quality.
Okay.
I think we definitely saw as the number of breweries exploded kind of between 2015 and 2019 in particular, the average quality dropped.
Okay.
There have always been, breweries that just nail their beer. It's really well made. It's really, nicely executed. But I think as a bunch of new entrants came in, there were a lot of quality control issues.
Okay.
What I can now say, as we've been seeing over the last 3 or 4 years, is some of that bottom end stuff is getting cleaned up. Like when I think about over the 5 years of the Alberta Beer Awards, for example, I remember the first year, there were a lot of infected beer, a lot of beer where it's kind of like, why are you even bothering to release this beer? Mm-hmm. It's got that many problems in it. That's disappearing. And so what I'm finding is happening, I would argue that the Alberta beer industry, to answer the second part of your question, is it's kind of middling, but getting there. There are a handful of star breweries who've really got it dialed in, really know what they're doing, and are probably world class in terms of producing beer. And then there's a lot of beer, like this last Alberta Beer Awards, which we judged just a couple months ago, and we'll be announcing the winners tonight. I found a lot of beer that was just kind of okay.
Yeah.
It was all right. It was clean. It just didn't have enough pop, or just didn't have enough that, or didn't have. And so I think right now the state of the Alberta industry, but it doesn't surprise me. That's exactly where it should be in its state of evolution, right? This is a maturing industry. It was a young industry a few years ago, which is why you saw these wild fluctuations of quality and some really great breweries and some really not so great breweries. And now that's starting to work itself out. Breweries are starting to figure their things out. And so I think this is where we're supposed to be. We're kind of in a middling level in terms of quality. And that's also about consumer preferences too. It's not just about the brewers, right? Alberta consumers are starting to learn, oh, a pale ale is supposed, just to use that as an example again, a pale ale is supposed to taste like this, not like that.
Right.
And so they're starting to understand the difference between a okay pale ale and a really good pale ale.
Okay.
And so I think that's a natural evolution, and we're just on that trajectory, and we'll continue to be on that trajectory, I think, for a few more years. But so I'm not concerned about it. I don't think any Alberta's an anomaly there. I think if I look across the country, we've seen that at various points, in every province, right? Depending on where they started, where they are in that pathway.
So one of the unique things that Alberta has, I think, is we have the Olds College brewing program. So it seems to me that, let's say before that program existed, a lot of people would have been home brewers and taken what they knew as a home brewer and then adapted that to commercial. Whereas now a lot of people are going to school to become brewers and then sort of entering the industry that way. Does having Olds College, does that improve the industry in general, or can people successfully go from home brewing to commercial brewing?
That's a great question. And I do think overall the impact of Olds has been positive for the industry. It's allowed for that expansion of the number of breweries. Like the only way we were able to quintuple the number of breweries in a 3-year span was because there was this supply of new young brewers who have been trained. As for homebrewers, I mean, I think some homebrewers can make that jump because if they understand, as long as they have to go in knowing there's a difference. And so they have to change the way they do things. They have to pay attention to things as a commercial brewer. You don't have to as a home brewer. So I think some can make that jump, but having a pool of professionally trained brewers who know how to run a brewery makes a big difference in terms of being able to prevent some, like I think a lot of what happened in those early years of the explosion of the big expansion was that a lot of them were home brewers. Right?
Yeah.
And so that's why we're getting infections. That's why we were getting product that you're kind of going, why is this coming out? Where I think if you get an Olds brewer, they're going to catch that stuff, right? Because they've been trained how to catch that stuff. And so I think it helps the bottom end. And I think especially as some of these brewers get experience and get more chops, they're just going to continue to improve, and the industry will improve along with them.
So you mentioned, and I mean, anyone who's followed the Alberta industry community sees it, obviously huge explosion in the number of breweries. And then we've seen, and you've reported on it over the last few months, there's been a number of them that have sadly had to close. I mean, you and I get to meet these people. We know how much effort they put into. So it's never great to see, businesses and breweries close. But what can we learn from the fact that there are closing? Like, does that tell us anything specifically, or is it just the nature of an industry that there are going to be closures?
I think there's two pieces. I mean, yes, this is just the nature of maturing industry. That as the industry continues to mature, people are going to fall away. There's not an industry on the planet where there aren't closures. Right. There's no industry where there's only openings and no failures. Yeah. But I think the second piece of the puzzle is that the reason I think we're seeing this cluster, because there's been about 7 that have closed in the last 2 or 3 months, at least that I know of. That's COVID. And I think COVID has kind of altered the dynamics. And it meant breweries who might have been able to limp along for a couple of years until they could maybe find a new investor or kind of get some cash flow injection just didn't have that runway. Because COVID just just had so many impacts that I think COVID has just kind of led to a number of the breweries that we've seen close. It's a major factor for why they did. Yeah. But overall, I mean, I've been expecting this for a while. I didn't expect them all to come in 2 or 3 months, but I was thinking we're going to see some fallback. It's expected.
Okay, so you guys were doing the awards, so you get to see all of the different beers that are coming out. Are there trends? Are there kind of exciting new trends that are coming out? And then conversely, are there trends that are coming to an end that maybe you're happy about too?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. We always do a trendy beer of the year category. Yeah. Right. And so we saw a year or 2 ago, it was low and no alcohol. Right, it was low alcohol beers starting to become a thing. I think what I'm starting to see now, I mean, clearly there's cold IPAs are starting to emerge in Alberta. And I'm mostly just seeing, I think the overall broader pattern is a bit of a shift towards drinkable lagers, moving back to that sort of clean, easy to quaff lager. So that's a trend I'm certainly seeing. And I think, I mean, I guess I wouldn't say that they're necessarily fading, but I think sort of everyone's got a New England now.
Yeah.
And so they've kind of lost their uniqueness.
Right.
So while there's still a lot of them out there, I suspect over the coming years we're going to see some of that falling away. There'll be, you won't have 3 different versions of a New England Pale Ale on your beer list, right? You might knock that down to 1, right? And the other thing I think we're seeing a shift to is the kettle sours are becoming more creative and more complex. It isn't just, here's a kettle sour, we'll throw some blueberry in it. Or here's a kettle sour and we'll dry hop it and call it done. There's a lot more creative combinations of flavors that they're trying to use with the base beer of a kettle sour, and they're just kind of playing with it more. So that would be the other trend I see.
Okay, so I like to inject a few dumb questions into each podcast, but what is a cold IPA?
That's not a dumb question.
Don't worry, I got more.
I mean, some people say it's basically an India Pale Lager, but I think I've come around to believe that that's not the case. So what it is, it's an IPA. It's basically designed to be fermented cooler and to be kind of crisper, and so not as not as fruity, not as it doesn't have that ale kind of esteriness, and so it's meant to be drier and cleaner, and so you have a sort of a sharper hop edge to it. Usually a little lighter in overall bitterness perceptions. So it's just kind of a sub-style that's emerged that I'm noticing Alberta breweries are starting to jump on. They could be quite refreshing. So I think it's about trying to get you that hop experience, but make it a little more patio-like, that you can have a form of an IPA sitting on a patio.
Yeah, no, and I find them a lot, they're a lot more, because I think that the concept of an IPA still scares some people, right? Where these are a little bit more just, easy drinking. But I've heard the term. I just have never known what it is. So you mentioned the 2 beers that you kind of had your epiphany with, both being European beers. And I know you live in Edmonton, and Edmonton has, Sherbrooke and a couple liquor stores that bring in some really cool beers from across Alberta, across North America, but also from Europe and stuff like that. With there being an explosion of local breweries, how can we balance that as an industry where we can still showcase the beers that inspired us, right? Because I think there needs to be a space for what there is out in the world, and then what there is in our own backyard. How do we balance that?
That's a really good question. I mean, and I even fall for that problem myself, right? Because I go to Sherbrooke. I think listeners may not be aware that Sherbrooke is, in terms of beer selection, the best liquor store in the country.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that because they're paying me. I'm saying that because I've been in a lot of liquor stores around the country. And it really has. I feel quite blessed to be sitting in the city with that kind of selection.
Are they paying you, though?
No.
Oh, damn. That'd be nice if both were true. Yeah.
So I fall for it, though, right? Because I go into the cooler. It's like, there's a new release from X Alberta brewery. There's a new release from other Alberta brewery. And so I find myself drawn to the new releases of the Alberta, So it can be easy to fall into that trap, right? I think we just have to remind ourselves that just because we've got this interesting industry now that's got lots going on, it's very dynamic, that there's a reason we fell in love with beer in the first place. And that's some of the classics. That's some of the European stuff. That's the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, sort of freaking Pale Ale, right? Like It's a classic version. And so I like to try and make sure I do that on every shopping trip. So I think that's what we just have to do, is just remind ourselves, what is something I haven't had in a while that I know I really like?
Yeah.
So I'll go and scoop up, I I just picked up, because it was Oktoberfest, I just picked up some of the Oktoberfest beers from Germany, right? Like, because they're just so good.
Yeah.
Right. And so I always try to do that. It's like, okay, I got my collection of new stuff from my Alberta breweries. Now, what's a bottle or a case that I can get of something I haven't had in a while? That's what I try to do to keep reminding myself that the world of beer is bigger than just the latest New England being released by a brewery in Calgary.
Yeah, and I think that that's what keeps you I think it's what keeps you kind of passionate is remembering, there's more to it. And we can be a big part of the overall beer community, but the beer community is global, very much so, right? I mean, Europe is insane. So industry, obviously there's challenges. The industry faces the same challenges as all the other industries. So we're talking inflation and taxes and all that sort of stuff. But I want to more focus on the industry positives, which is, and even this weekend, or it's not weekend, it's the week. It feels like a weekend to me. When you're drinking beer at 11 o'clock in the morning, it feels like a weekend. But as you've seen the industry mature, what do you think is special about the Alberta beer community?
I think two things. I mean, one is I think they're still small enough that it still feels very much like a community, right? That they haven't become an industry, that they basically everybody still knows everybody or almost everybody, right? And they're still willing to help each other out. And there still is this conference has been really fun because it's the first one, since COVID. And I'm just noticing it's a room full of people going, oh my God, I haven't seen you in 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And so there's the joy just in being able to get together again. I think so that's the first one. And I think the second one that it may actually be underappreciated is we have somehow organically developed a remarkable range of styles and approaches to brewing, right? You can get everything from your classic kind of patio style pale lager to various mixed ferments to, Blind Enthusiasm's, lambic styles, right?
Yeah.
Like there is an unbelievable breadth of styles and of brewing approaches in this province that I think I think we don't appreciate just how broad it's become and how quickly it has. It's not all done at a world-class level yet, but I just think that really speaks to a lot of potential, that there's a lot of room for different business models. There's a lot of room to be able to find a niche in this system, in this industry, and make it work.
Have you had a chance to try the Unity brew?
Not this one, no.
Yeah. I find that is such a fun project that they do, and so it's really cool to see that they as a community still come together to brew a special beer together. So things like that, as much as we can encourage it and share those stories, because there's specific things that are happening that I think are really, really cool. Years ago, so we met when we first started doing the beer festival in Edmonton, and you and I would sit down and have beers every now and again. One of the things that always stuck out to me is you mentioned the one time when people were asking you to review beers, that you would, and if you can correct me here, but the way I took it was, if someone say gave you beers to review and you liked it, you would share that with your audience, and if you didn't like it, the way of expressing that would be that you didn't share it with your audience. And so you're basically sharing positive news and not, if you think about social media now, it's the opposite of that, where it's just like the only thing a lot of people say is just the shit that they can talk about other people and other brands and stuff like that. But the way that you had it, that your philosophy is, if I like something, I'll share it. If I don't like it, then I just won't talk about it, is how I took that. And I've used that in a lot of the things that I do. Is that accurate? Is that kind of your philosophy?
Yeah, when it comes to local small breweries or Canadian breweries, that is very much my model. Is I don't believe they've got enough that they got to deal with, right?
Yeah.
Like they're trying to be this tiny little player in a market dominated by the multinationals. They're dealing with regulations. They're dealing with HLC. They got all these things. They don't need me piling on, and so I'm happy to have private conversations with them, and I'm often very honest in private conversations. So it's not like I, just pretend. But I don't see my role as being the grumpy critic who sits in the corner. I see my job as being sharing with the world what craft beer can offer.
Right.
I'm trying to open up the world of craft beer to readers and listeners. Doesn't mean I'm not occasionally willing to do some shit talking about one of the big corporate breweries when they do something really stupid.
Yeah.
But that's an exception because they don't need my help.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, I try to be positive. I try to just generally with what I try and do in the beer world is I try and emit a positivity.
Yeah.
Because I think we need that, right? In this world of the social media cesspools, I think being able to sort of articulate things in a, and the flip side of this is even when I am critiquing, I try and do it constructively.
Right.
And so a lot of when I do reviews, like straight up reviews, this beer, I mostly just try and take an attitude of, I'm going to tell you what I taste and smell. I'm just going to describe it. And then I'm going to let the reader decide, is that something I might enjoy?
Right.
And I don't add a lot of adjectives and a lot of like, oh, this beer isn't as good as it could be. Like I just sort of say, this is what I'm tasting.
Yeah.
And then let the reader decide whether that's something they might want to pursue.
So right now, when you think of the beer community, beer industry, and your role in it, what are you most passionate about these days?
That's a good question.
That's a great question. I was gonna...
I think I still get most excited when I see something creative being done, right? Like I've actually I haven't had a chance to get there yet, but I'm really wanting to. It's become a big list thing of my priorities. There's a new brewery in Rosalind, just outside Edmonton. And they've opened in an old closed schoolhouse. And so they've actually taken over this school, and they sounds like, and that's why I got to get there, that they've done it in a very creative and fun way. And so I get excited when I see someone, whether it be in a new beer that they've released or something they're doing with their tap room, or when they're doing something that's just kind of not the normal, that's when I get really excited. I'm like, wow, we still have the capacity for like originality and creativity and just I'm just going to put it out there and do my thing. That's when I get really excited.
And you still homebrew?
Yes.
You said you have 2 on the go right now?
Yeah, I brewed last week, so I've got 2 in the fermenters at the moment. Yeah, I did up a Czech Pilsner and a wee heavy.
And is it all? How do you approach it? Do you approach it scientifically or do you approach it artistically? Would you say when you think about beer?
Yeah, I think I'm more on the artistic end.
Yeah.
I mean, I pay enough attention to the science to make sure I don't screw it up.
Yeah.
Right. So obviously, I'm quite fastidious about my sanitation and cleanliness. I watch my mash temperatures. I pay attention to my pH. So I do that. But beyond that, no.
Yeah.
Like when I'm designing my recipes, it's a lot by feel. Right? It's just a lot of what flavor do I want? Oh, okay, and also it's also bound by what I happen to have in stock or something. Right? Oh, I don't have any Crystal 60. I guess I'll throw some Crystal 80 in. Right. So there is about that too. But yeah, I'm more on the artistic side. I like the creativity of being able to toss this in. What happens if I swap this hops for that hops? What happens? And so I'm kind of more on that end.
And do you have it to the point where you have it dialed in? I remember years ago we were talking about it, and you had messed something up, and you were explaining to me. I don't know if it was infected or whatever, but do you still have those situations occur the odd time where you totally mess up?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's the fun part about it. Is that I think just when I think everything's going along fine. Like for example, I was earlier this summer. I always do 2 batches in a day. And so I was obsessing. One of them was going to be a New England IPA, and so I was obsessing about that. And the other one was just an Irish Red Ale. And so I was boiling up the Irish Red while I was fussing about the mash, and I was fussing about the New England. And I completely forgot to add my Irish moss. And Irish moss is a clarifying agent. I completely blanked it out. Didn't realize it until the thing was already in the fermenter. Couldn't do anything about it, right? And it was just a dumb mistake.
Yeah.
Right. It was just I wasn't paying enough attention. So it happens all the time. And in fact, it kind of wrecked what could have been a really good beer. I added some post clarifying agents, but it just wasn't the same.
Right.
And the beer just wasn't the same because I just missed it. So I do know I still make mistakes. Things still go awry on me. A few years ago, maybe this was a story I was telling you. I kept getting a series of batches that when putting them in the keg or the bottle tasted just fine, and then 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, would be overcarbonated, would be over attenuated, and it'd be like, what the heck is going on? And I finally figured out that the common denominator is around that time my spouse had started making kombucha.
Oh.
And I think I got some kind of cross-contamination.
Right.
And so I basically evoked seniority and said, you are no longer a kombucha maker because I am still a brewer. And the problem went away.
Nice.
I mean, I had to clean all my equipment and I threw out all my plastic, et cetera, but Yeah. So yeah, it happens. It's because you're dealing with a live beast. That's
Yeah.
what I love about it. You're dealing with something that's alive,
Yeah.
and I don't make beer. The yeast makes beer.
Yeah.
All I can do is create the conditions, and so that's how that there's an element of unpredictability there that I quite love.
And the idea that there's only 4 ingredients that you're working with, right? Like it's you would think at this point that we've tried and we've tasted and we've seen every variation that there's out there, and just when you think that that might be true, you taste something that's totally different, and
it's because the elements you can so many different types of malts you can use, and even yeasts in particular, right? Like I'm drinking a saison that I made right now.
Yeah.
And it has just this little hint of smokiness in it, just a touch,
Yeah.
just in the background. It's beautiful. Really adds something to the beer. I've never had that in my saisons before, and that's got to be the yeast,
Right.
and just the particular conditions, the temperature that I had it at, that it just triggered that particular ester, where it didn't the last time I did it. So I love them. So even though it's 4 ingredients, it's 4 very complex and dynamic ingredients.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. This has been awesome because, it's been a few years since we've been able to connect, obviously, with COVID and all that crap. So nice to see that you're as passionate or more so than you were when we met years ago. So thanks for taking the time and sharing your story.
It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks.